Hello, welcome to DVB English News. I am Ning Sud. Former U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar Scot Marciel published his book Imperfect Partners in March. Marciel served at the U.S. Embassy in Yangon for 4 years from 2016 to 2020. His book shares his experience working as a diplomat across Southeast Asia. DVB interview presenter Yamin Mie sat down with Marciel to discuss what's happening in Myanmar before and after the 2021 military coup.
Welcome to our program.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
When I read this book, I found out that you provide the valuable insight into the situations of the countries, including Myanmar. So, however, I still have some questions. So, first of all, I would like to focus on the reform process, which was started over 10 years ago. So, when I read this book, I feel like you are also a key proponent to push the reform process and believing in dialogue. So, my question is, what was the reason for the pushing reforms, and why did you believe in engaging in dialogue?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of Americans have cared a lot about Myanmar, or Burma, as a lot of Americans still call it, for many years. I think we've seen the suffering of so many people under very problematic governments. And so when we saw an opening during the same period initially, beginning in 2011, 2012, we were surprised, but initially, I think a lot of Americans and American officials were skeptical. But as we saw real change, release of political prisoners, the end of censorship, economic reforms, the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, the formation of other political parties, etc., we began to see that there was real change. And this is something that we wanted, really not so much for geostrategic reasons, but just because we like to see people have freedom and opportunity. And so the Obama administration, of which I was a part, agreed that we should do everything we could to support the reforms. Obviously, we couldn't create them, but to try to support the people who were carrying out reforms and help any way we could. And that meant engaging with the government, even though there were still problems, and having honest conversations, providing assistance wherever we could, and sometimes offering recommendations. And I think that was the right decision.
Yes. So in a reform period, people have been to enjoy the taste of the democracy. And however, the military staged the coup against in 2021. So regarding the coup, some people said that they can predict what will happen in Myanmar. So my question is, did you also notice or get any information that lead you to believe that the military coup would occur against Myanmar?
Well, I didn't receive any information that led me to believe there would be a coup. Certainly in my time in Myanmar, I saw that the military was quite focused on maintaining its power and was blocking important reforms and continuing to carry out military operations that involved a lot of human rights violations, most notably against the Rohingya, but there were others as well, the Kachin and many more. But I didn't expect a coup, for the simple reason that the military already had, under the Constitution, a lot of power. And so I thought that a coup would be harmful not only for the country, but for the military. So for that reason, I didn't expect a coup.
Yes, but according to your book, by early 2012, the NLD decided to participate in the parliamentary by-elections in April, but the violent outbreaks in Rakhine in June 2012. So it took 2 months after the NLD decisions to participate in the parliamentary process. So did you notice the fit in the timings?
Yeah, we did, although, I mean, I didn't have any information. And I have to say, in 2012, I was assigned in Indonesia So I wasn't directly involved in Myanmar affairs at the time, but I don't think we had any information that suggested the two were connected. Possibly they were, but I never saw any information like that.
Yes. So, but Burmese peoples understand that the Rohingya issue is just gained by the military. So what is your understanding on this case?
Well, my view on this might not be so popular. I think that the Rohingya people had been subject to discrimination for a long time by the military government, of course. And during that time, the military had engaged in a lot of propaganda to make people fear the Rohingya community or think that somehow they didn't belong in Myanmar. So later on, not only in 2012, but afterwards, and especially in 2016 and 2017, when the military carried out these operations against the Rohingya that led to 700,000 or 800,000 people fleeing the country, that was terrible. And that was the military engaged in violence. But there wasn't a lot of support in the broader Myanmar community for the Rohingya. There wasn't much sympathy for them, I think, as a result of all those years of propaganda, perhaps.
Yes. Now, my questions related to the first question. So when reform started in Myanmar, the United States used all effort to smooth the reform process and maintain the optimism. That my question is, do you retain any optimism for the reform, or do you still hold any hope that today challenges can be resolved through the dialogue?
It's hard to be optimistic for the short term right now because of the coup and the military's violent behavior and mismanagement since the coup. I retain hope longer term because I think we've seen since the coup that the Myanmar people, almost all Myanmar people, have made clear they don't want to return to this military rule and they want more freedom and opportunity. And I also see, since the coup, I think some real open dialogue and discussions among different communities that maybe haven't trusted each other in the past. So while I'm not optimistic in the short term, I do think there is hope for Myanmar over the longer term. But it requires, of course, for the military to be weakened to the point that it returns to the barracks and gives up political power. As long as the military is in political power, I don't see much hope. As for dialogue, I mean, that's up to the Myanmar people to decide, not a foreigner. I don't see much opportunity for dialogue right now because the military has shown no signs of willingness to make any kinds of compromises, most importantly. Now, and until the military shows that it wants to find a way out of this situation and therefore is willing to make major compromises, I don't personally see a lot of opportunity for dialogue between the resistance and the military. But I think there is really important dialogue going on among all the different communities in Myanmar with each other, not with the military, but with each other. And I think that's really important, and I hope it continues.
Previously, you believed that the sanction alone was not effective to deal with Myanmar issues. So later, U.S. considered to do reforms and lifted sanction. However, the military broke the 2008 constitutions and staged the coup against in 2021. Mm-hmm. So in this regard, it is like a history repeat against the United States and its allies, including EU, impose sanctions on SCCs and other related peoples and entities. So what is your opinions on imposing sanctions in this very time?
I don't think that sanctions alone are very effective. But I think in the current situation, the military, the only hope I see for the country is for the military junta to be weakened so much that they are willing to make major concessions to escape from this crisis. that requires a lot of pressure on the military. Most of that pressure has to come and is coming from inside the country. The resistance, the civil disobedience movement, all of these things from the people themselves. The international community can contribute through sanctions. So it's the US and European sanctions and other sanctions by themselves won't have a huge impact. But combined with the pressure from the Myanmar people, I hope over time will weaken the junta dramatically.
Yes. For my next question related to ASEAN, and how do you understand the current ASEAN approach to solving Myanmar issues?
Well, ASEAN's stuck because ASEAN as a grouping of 10 countries, including Myanmar, makes decisions by consensus. And ASEAN is divided. Some countries clearly are very unhappy with the coup and the current situation in Myanmar, like Indonesia, for example, and others. And they are pushing for a tougher position. But other countries in ASEAN say, well, we shouldn't interfere in domestic affairs. So that's why ASEAN is divided, and as a result, has not been able to come up with a very strong position. And it's just the way ASEAN works. I think it's good that ASEAN is not inviting the junta leadership to its meetings. I hope that continues, and I hope it's expanded to include other lower level officials not being included. But I don't see ASEAN being able to change and reach a consensus on a dramatically bolder policy.
Yeah, for example, the without time frame, more than that, some countries are closely associated with the SEC. So under these circumstances, do you have any worry on that?
Yeah, I mean, the countries that are supporting the SAC, I think, are doing that for their own interests. I think it's very harmful. The SAC, I think, has shown that it is incapable of governing the country and restoring stability, not to mention all of the human rights violations it's committed. So I think the countries that are betting on the junta are making a mistake, because the juntas, I don't see them prevailing. But it is concern. It would be much better if those countries were putting more pressure on the junta and supporting the people of Myanmar.
So Myanmar Supreme Revolution has a strong determination, but it found it difficult to get a battery in this situation. So what could serve as the decisive turning point for the Myanmar Supreme Revolutions?
It's really hard for me to say. I think, it's unpredictable. I think at this point, these things take time, unfortunately. There's a lot of suffering in the meantime. I think for the various groups within the resistance, the NUG, the ethnic resistance organizations, etc., to increase their cooperation and show that they have a clear vision for the future of the country, some kind of federal system and so on. The more they can do that, the more I think they will gain support. And then it's a matter of continuing international and domestic pressure on the military, to the point that the military is severely weakened. I think it's already been weakened, but not sufficiently. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any easy answer or dramatic event that's going to, resolve this quickly. It's probably going to take quite some time.
Yes, because the presence of the obstacles such as the support from the country like China and the Russia to the SEC has hindered the revolution to get a battery. So I would like to know what pedals might eventually lead to the tipping point in this struggle.
Well, I mean, we have to see what happens in Russia. Russia right now is in very bad shape because of its invasion of Ukraine. It's suffered a lot of casualties. Its economy is in bad shape, and it has lost a lot of influence internationally. So that's one. China, I mean, I certainly can't speak for the Chinese government. I don't think that the Chinese government loves the junta. I don't think they have long-term loyalty to the junta. They're just dealing with whichever government happens to be in place. And so if things were to change and it looked like the junta were losing and the resistance was winning, I think China would be fine working with a new government if that happened. But I think what is going to change things is much more on the inside, combined with this pressure. You do see growing pressure externally. At least, one Singapore bank, reducing its ties, other banks from other countries reducing ties. So this is putting a lot of financial pressure on the military. And the military also has no idea how to run the economy. So I think economically and financially, the military is facing a lot of problems. It's suffering from morale problems, lack of soldiers, these sorts of things. So I don't want to predict anything because I don't know how this is going to happen. But I think you're seeing growing pressure on the junta, and it's a matter of sustaining and increasing that pressure. Maybe that will lead to a sudden change, or maybe it will be a slow change over many months. It's hard to predict.
Thank you. And in December 2022, the United States Congress approved the Burma Bill. So nevertheless, criticized the Myanmar lacks significant geopolitical importance for the United States, pointing the fact that the United States is primarily safeguarding democracy. So what is your perspective on this matter?
Well, I think the Congress's passage of the Burma Act reflected, I think, a strong view. One of the few things that Democrats and Republicans in the United States agree on is support for democracy and freedom in Myanmar. So that's a positive. I think some people in the United States don't appreciate how strategically important Myanmar is. It is quite important strategically. But for many, many years, at least since 1988, the U.S. policy toward Myanmar has been based much more, if I could say, on almost emotion, a strong sense of sympathy for the people, and a disappointment with the military and the generals and the way they've treated people, and really a much more almost moral support for the people of Myanmar. So that, rather than geostrategic interests, is really what's driving the United States to support the people of Myanmar against this junta. I think it is geostrategically important, but it's much more the feeling of sympathy and empathy for the people, and respect and admiration for the Myanmar people.
Yeah. My next question is, what is your evaluation of the Myanmar Supreme Revolution? Do you think it will be a prolonged process?
Unfortunately, it probably will. I think it's important to remember when this started back in, let's say, late February, March, April of 2021, first with the peaceful protests, and then later with the development of the broader resistance to civil disobedience movement. I think many people, including a lot of my Myanmar friends, thought that the military would be able to suppress it all very quickly. And so instead, what we've seen is, in 2.5 years, the development of a really national uprising against the military, unprecedented levels of cooperation between Burma people, from the NLD and other parties, with ethnic resistance groups, the development of some local governance, and increasing success in military operations against the military. So I think it's been remarkable how much has been achieved. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be over soon. I wish it were. But to me, it's most likely that this continues for some time. I can't predict how long. Because the military, as we know, doesn't give up easily, doesn't compromise easily. So its will has to be broken. And it's very hard to say how long that will take. And as an outsider, I want it to succeed, but I'm also very mindful of the tremendous suffering that people are facing on a daily basis. I have great admiration for the people who are just surviving this, as well as those who are engaged in the resistance. So I think time is on the side of the broader resistance, but it's very hard for me to say how long it will take.
Yeah, my last question. Some saying that Burma is turning to the failed state. So what do you think of that view?
There's a risk. I mean, to a certain extent, it's the military has caused it to fail in some respects. So I think if the longer the military stays in power, the greater the chance of a failed state. Meaning, what do we mean by a failed state? A state that maybe splits apart, where the national government only has limited control. I think, on the other hand, the increasing cooperation we see among different communities in the country involved in the resistance and the civil disobedience movement actually creates longer term the best opportunity the country's had in many years for a successful state. So there is a risk of that if the military state clings to power for long enough. But I think there's also an opportunity for a transition to a much more successful system.
Thank you so much. And you provide the valuable insight into the situation, Mr. Investor.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.